Thank you so much. It's amazing to be here. I'm so honored not only to be part of this exhibition, but to be invited to come and talk about my work. So I'm thrilled. I'm going to frame this lecture around this idea of the garden, as Sarah so sweetly mentioned. And really it is this frame, and then within that, rapidly show you a compressed evolution of the work over time. So to begin, the garden, its historical development, myriad forms, and metaphoric language has informed my work for many years and is the primary lens through which I understand and perceive my environment. The garden ethic, as Michael Pollan describes in his book, Second Nature, which was the first book he wrote and my favorite, is an approach to man's relation to the natural world that doesn't assume that man's impact on the environment will always be negative. So this notion has influenced my thinking on and continued interest in the garden as a model and source of inspiration. And many artists have taken up the subject of the garden in their work. More and more exhibitions have been devoted to it over the years. In New York City alone, After Nature at the New Museum was an apocalyptic vision of the future inspired by the epic poem of the same name by W.G. Siebold. Down the Garden Path was an ambitious survey of contemporary artists' work at the Queens Museum of Art. And the Garden Party at Deitch Projects, when Jeffrey Deitch had a gallery in 2006, included Yoko Ono, Liza Liu, a number of contemporary artists of note. And even MoMA opened Groundswell to showcase contemporary landscape architects. So what I propose that is unique about the garden and why it's a place that has taken hold of so many artists' imaginations is that it's a place that straddles a seeming opposition between nature and culture. It's a man-made creation, a constructed site. I'm just going to see if I can do this. That includes us in its design. So this inclusion, our role in its cultivation, growth, and flourishing, suggests the possibility of a relation with the natural world predicated on care. And Hannah Arendt writes about the notion of the culture of care, which is based on the vita activa, which is really about the fruits of a life lived filled with work, labor, or action, something that artists know all about. So what excited me about this site is it's a complex site of contradiction and paradox, and paradise. The garden is as much about tranquility and reproduction as it is about war and death. So as Mara Miller writes in her book, The Garden as an Art, the act of creating a garden is an attempt at the reconciliation of opposites which constrain our existence. And as such, it is always an act of hope, end quote. And this manifesto by Alan S. Weiss captures the rich possibilities that this form evokes. The garden is a symbolic form. The garden contains other symbolic forms. The garden is a Gesamtkunstwerk. The garden is a synesthetic matrix. The garden is a memory theater. The garden is a narrative, a transformer of narratives, a generator of narratives. The garden is a hyperbolically ephemeral structure. The garden is simultaneously a hermetic space and an object in the world. The garden is a paradox combining mathematics and magic, history and myth, science and art, reality and utopia. And the unpeopled garden is either an abstraction or a ruin. I've always associated gardens with contemplation, and the way in which it's always attached to the home. So the Latin term hortus conclusus literally means enclosed garden and defines the garden in one critical way by its sense of enclosure. And it's that aspect of containment that gardens share with the history of ceramics in its forms and metaphoric language. So I became fascinated with the formal composition of the Paradise Garden. I was actually studied landscape architecture a little bit at Rhode Island School of Design. And especially how it comes across in old literature, whether it's Old Testament, Song of Solomon. And what unified these visions were trees, water, often in the form of four rivers, sometimes a fountain, as well as a wall or fenced enclosure. You were either inside or out with no possibility of return. And I came across a rereading of the Parable of the Fall in which Thank God for Eve, otherwise we would have been doomed to a life of adolescent existence and had no ability to feel pain and reap the joys of a life fully lived, which I really love that rereading of it. Because other readings I came across were the seduction of reason, Adam, by sensuality, Eve, through the sinful preoccupation with things, and that the garden represented the world or sphere of daily contact with things for good or for evil. But to counter that idea of the badness of things, Max Weber, he writes an essay on things in which he says, culture will come when every man knows how to address himself to the inanimate, simple things of life, a pot, a cup, a piece of calico, a chair. Culture will come when people touch things with love and see them with a penetrating eye. He concludes by offering, it is only through things that one discerns himself. So the garden is not only a site that is both, that is mythic, but it's also real. And I grew up in one. And I want to nod to that lifelong conversation on the arts that I've been privileged to have with my mother, who is a gardener, but also a garden writer, a writer about garden design. And these are just some early pictures of her own garden. So what I'm going to share with you just briefly is just some influences that have shaped my thinking that are profound at critical moments. Very quickly, I'm going to go very quickly through some early work and then slow down as we get closer. So Bernard Palissy, a 16th century French Huguenot chemist potter, was fascinated with recreating the world around him. He cast life forms of reptiles, crustaceans, plants, and insects to adorn what he called his rustic basins or grotto-ware. His obsession with minute life forms yielded small worlds, ecosystems that transformed how we understand the ceramic vessel. They represented both the site and the material it was made from. His piece of sculpted turf became a cultural artifact and a referent for the natural world. That idea that an object could speak on two scales simultaneously and of two landscapes, that of the table and the land, affected my own work as an artist profoundly. So my early work explored similar tensions in scale and drew inspiration from Wunderkammern or early natural history collections where man-made and natural objects shared the same space. I was interested in creating, in the experience of using my work, a sensation akin to our explorations of the natural world. So I wanted to explore how objects could invite interactions that resulted in unexpected discoveries, as in this stacked pepper bowl set, this stacked salad bowl set with pepper shaker. At first glance, the object appears to be a plant, transporting the viewer to a lush or mysterious landscape within the private domain of the table. But on closer inspection, as the user lifts the top, it's a pepper shaker, and on further investigation, finds multiple bowls nested beneath. It's somewhat, it now seems cliche to mention George Eure, but at the time when I stumbled upon his work in graduate school, there were no books written about him. There were no exhibitions devoted to his work, and this is in the mid-'80s, early mid-'80s. And so I found him to be this unbelievable treasure trove of interest. And like many of the artists that I'm going to show, someone who's deeply interested in language as well as multiple media. So he did trick photography. He named his kids so that their initials were their first names, Leo, Theo, Cleo, da, da, da. I mean, everything was his artwork. Everything was a playing field. But what was amazing is I came across a 3-page autobiography that's just well worth trying to find and read. And he had his apprenticeship with his father as a wrought iron worker, decorative wrought iron. And you can see that influence in the way that he invented these forms. But he threw these pieces very, very, very thin and then, quote unquote, wrang their necks. And then the pieces would collapse in on themselves and create these incredible undulations, which I was very drawn to, as I was to the use of color, the overt sexuality of his work, incredibly bawdy. This is literally called vagina pot, and I'm not sure if that's his term or another application from us. But you know, he had this very nurturing relationship with his mud babies, no two alike. So I was always interested, and this is just the first 6 years of my career was making vessels. and playing with this idea of creating a place that the viewer was asked to physically interact with the work in a way that charged the relationship between user and object. And so this is actually a piece that it was kind of my black and white still animation as part of it was a project we did, a one-day exhibition called the Garden Show at Four Walls in Brooklyn. And we invited both garden designers and artists to project their work. So this is the projection of my landscape. You're sort of coming in from an aerial perspective into what's called the landing. But these works, in every way, were, I wanted to sort of play with how should they be handled, how the meaning of the work was reinforced or challenged by that interaction, and what the relationship was to the body. So in every piece, there was hopefully simultaneously a relationship to landscape or plant, as well as container and body, and yet doing so abstractly. And I often found that the formal language of ceramics profoundly intriguing. How far could you stretch the definition of any form? What is a bowl? When does it change? So these are at the core of why I was interested in the material for so long. Its history of involvement with use, containment, connection to the body, daily ritual, and performance. So these evolved over time to this point where I'm going to really start. And then I found that one of the things that I was curious about was this unexpected relationship between user and object, and how I could play with roles, transgress biological norms, perhaps. And this is when I started making the Lady J series, which at the time, these are to enable women to urinate standing up. And I thought that I had invented something, and I was thrilled that my ship had come in, this was it. Until a graduate student at Hunter brought me this paper version, which he had on a trip to India, called Le Fennel. When you're on the town, out of town, can't sit down, Le Fennel, which I loved. But I decided I wasn't going to be deterred. I was still going to make my own versions of these Lady J's. So my Villa d'Este, Italian fountain piece, and the medieval cod piece, and the uncircumcised little boy version. And I thought, why stick with a male model? So I just kept going, so 2-spouted and 3-spouted, and then the bear claw, leaving tracks in the woods behind you. And then the messy version is called Sprinkle. And this series, I'm doing it very quick, but this started in 1994 and went to 1999. And what I did is I started to document the work in use. And in exchange for Lady J, I asked women, would they allow me to photograph them? They'd give me a photograph of them using it. And then collected these over time and displayed them as part of this, this installation, in which there was this kind of wonderful, all the kind of role play and the humor, the connection to the body is evident, and yet we're still a voyeur. Our relationship to that real act or physical touch is distance. This also resulted in a companion piece called, which allowed men to simulate breastfeeding. These are nursing bottles for men to nurse babies with. And a detail shows the steel table, which actually had a plate that is a milk glass, which is a hand-poured glass. So following this idea and engaging the place setting as a, perhaps not just as a prop in a landscape, if you will, I wanted to create a set that was for a particular narrative, particular character. And so I designed this place setting for the devil to eat his dinner out of, and it was called the fall set. And it disassembles into a wine cup of various bowls that stack. And had the good fortune of working with Peter Hollish, who was a collaborator with Andy Warhol and founder of Squat Theater in New York, and he collaborated with me in order to produce this video called The Fall. And he did an incredible job of eating, drinking, smoking, belching, and ending the meal with an incredible sort of bacchanalian gesture. Pictured here is David Pasternak, who is the main chef. He helped design the menu, again, to kind of mimic the landscape, that it's a descent in the meal and a descent in the landscape, and so the lobster was the main course. And I made the novice mistake of being the server in the video, which is very, very difficult. It's hard to be in front of the camera and direct, but I was very lucky to have a good co-director. But throughout you just see my hands disassembling the set as each dish is filled and delivered again. And it ends also with 2 desserts. We had too many desserts to choose from, so it just kind of goes on and on. But it was a thrilling experience. And again, kind of was one of these documentations that allowed me to kind of explore the possibility of charging, seeing what the object could do as both setting and character in some way. And these are just the behind the scenes shots. I came to Colorado from New York in 2000, well actually it was 1999, and had a show at Rule Gallery, and this one's called Holding Patterns, Objects in Action, which I was very interested in this notion of distance and how I could explore the desire to touch, which we commonly associate with intimacy, and still paradoxically how that could also engender a psychological distance. So these pinched surfaces of the Bride Stripped Bare series record the process of manufacture and invite viewers' touch, but the numerous handles act as cages around the pieces and prevent that contact. And these are all after famous brides in literature, so Havisham Bride, Woman in White, etc. And I wanted to describe this sort of, that limbo of frustrated desire, of circling, floating, going nowhere, not landing, but circling, waiting to land, as a tactile relationship in these works, and as a psychological and physical condition with the sculptures in the exhibit. So I did a series of these medallions as well that are my idea of a kind of salad plate series, if you will, where the body part, the lips or the mouth, and the leaf and the plate are bound into one form. So that's succulent and this is sprout. And then later, and I'm sorry these are a little blown out, I was invited to do a series of prints. These are color lithographies, a suite of 4 that are the salad plate drawings. And there's actually a white plate and a damask tablecloth that you can't see. It's quite subtle. But each of these is a different body part. So it's a profile of a lip in this one, and this is called mixed salad. This is a nose, and it's called spun salad. Tossed salad. And then this is green salad. It's actually, they're all lips, different sized lips, and I have Cindy Crawford's lips in the center with that mole, and it's amazing. It creates that incredible little stamen right there. Anyway, so part of this show, I also did a performance piece where I designed a red velvet dress and had an actress play the part of this pocket lady, and there's 40 pockets in this dress. And during the opening, 40 people were allowed to choose and reach into one of the pockets of this anonymous woman's red velvet dress, which this intrusion into a space of a stranger is something rarely allowed. And it was a brief breach of that common barrier between desire and distance. And then all of the dress and its hidden recesses and objects, each of which related to the theme of holding patterns, was really a tactile sculpture during that night. So these are sex dice on the side, so that's different sexual position on one die, and then it's in the kitchen, in the bathroom, in the closet, in the bedroom, on the other die, and roll them. These are, sometimes the experience of putting your hand in a pocket actually was like putting your hand in a glove and then removing it. So there was a sort of flipping of exterior, interior. This is a laced wishbone, Irish wedding ring. That's a hand clasping ring that opens, closes. And then I had a photographic series with this also of the same title, Minnesota Midway and San Sebastian, Spain, and others. But this one, I couldn't believe the good fortune of having this man with a bald spot sitting right in front of me. Couldn't have been better. At a bullfight. I just must have taken like so many rolls of film to center his head. Anyway, Mirage was really the first of a series of installations where I wanted to allow the viewer to physically enter the work and fabricate a site that would refer to its own construction, reflexive constructions, if you will. And it was really this idea of, and it's a painted plaster island with ceramic palm trees and succulents, and it was exhibited at the MCA in Denver in 2000. And I even had a pineapple form there that sort of hospitality. And there was also a vacancy sign I had made that had no on it, and it was motion detecting, so when you came up it said vacancy. So if you can't find a place, you can make it. And to activate the piece, I hired a palmist to read palms in the Palm Oasis. Another projection of a future, a distant future there. And Sahai, I don't know how good she was, because she told Sahai Johnson, who was pregnant with her daughter, that she was having a son. And then Mark Masaoka, who was the director at the time, he had his palm read, and he was before the opening, and he was very serious, and he wouldn't tell us anything about what had been said afterward. And the next day he quit. I felt responsible. He quit as director. It was really upsetting. Anyway, then a number of years later, Cabinet Magazine did a horticultural, they do theme-based arts and culture. They're wonderful. They're out of Brooklyn, New York, and they're so great. They're one of my favorite kind of niche publications. Really smart and perfect for a polymath. Anyway, they did a horticultural edition and asked me to design a seed packet for them. So I did Fata Morgana, and I did my Mirage. And these literally I had priced out all the seeds. They had all the seeds of all the things I would want in my oasis if I grew one myself. Banana trees, certain kind of palms, etc. I went to sorry, I'm going to go back, to Italy for a time and became really enamored with the formal gardens, the material, the terracotta, and then also the traditions, the decorative arts museums, where you would see these traditions like bocage, which are these, rococo porcelain flowers intricately sculpted and typically encrusting some form or another, and influenced by theater set design of the Romantic period and Romantic painting like Boucher. And so they became these very interesting objects to me, and what I started doing was making these small maquettes while I was there with the intention that I would blow these up when I came back, not to the scale of the decorative object, but to the scale of the thing itself, so to the plant, to the size of the plant. So what does it mean to create something that's a decorative object and then blow it to a scale of what would be monumental in that sense, but the scale of the real? So I did this on with a number of those early maquettes, and then that led me to a number of these sort of Bush series. I had an opportunity to work with a rug designer in Kansas City and produce these rugs as ground planes for these sculptures. And each one of the rugs are influenced by an 18th century garden plan that has a different organizing principle for that landscape. So maze or radiating avenues, or the meander or the farm. And then use this as a kind of way to explore convoluted geometries that suggest the way in which gardens are both vehicles for and objects of desire. And that the bushes punctuated the center of each of these patterns really was drawing attention to how nature really acts as a prop, often at the service of human fantasy. And then was also invited in 2007 to do a private commission in Austin, Texas. And this was the first time I brought my work outside, and was really excited by this opportunity to do a very formal procession of sculpture on this 53-foot-long pool with an incredible, lush, leafy backdrop, which allowed me to really see for the first time this relationship between the artificial and the real in situ. So these are just a couple of those pieces. They're about 40 inches high, and they're sitting on Texas limestone. Really beautiful. And then this is just, I went to Kohler and worked in the foundry for a while, which is like a candy store. It's just the most incredibly beautiful material choices that you have. It was an amazing also opportunity to explore what I can do in ceramic. And I made lots of different work, laurel wreaths and trees, and then these bathing cap bushes. I actually went on eBay, bought tons of bathing caps, you know, the old-fashioned kind, and cast them in brass and cast iron and for the garden, put them around, floating heads. But while I was there, I stumbled on a few estates that had these garden statuary and became really fascinated with these extremely crude, very heavy concrete objects that serve as markers to the entrances of estates. And yet what they depict is sort of this light, fleeting memento mori. And I wanted to play with this idea of what could I, how could you create, use this marker to talk about fleeting youth, fecundity, beauty, the notion of the fall, the notion of something is going to just about to be overtaken, to fall apart. And so these are just some of those in a series. This is Perruque, which is French for wig, and I kind of thought of it as my Marie Antoinette piece. And then did this exhibition called Cold Pastoral, where I created a promenade or the illusion of an expanse by covering the gallery's back wall with mirrors, mirrored tile, and lining up each of the sculpture on an axis down the gallery. And then interspersed with large photos I'd taken of French formal gardens. So what was interesting and I didn't expect is you became implicated in the landscape. As you started to walk into this, then you saw yourself in the mirrors, and it did indeed double that space and bring the green from the outside in, and creating this kind of endless vista. One of the things I was trying to enact, and in that way I was really interested in this becoming this theatrical stage, if you will, was this idea of engaging with the history of modernism. And on my research trip to France, I was photographing Versailles and Villandry and Fontainebleau. And at Versailles, this is a side garden, and I couldn't believe how similar this was to sort of grand gestures of earth art. And the echoes that it had with modernist and minimalist traditions, even constructivist traditions. So this was named after Bruce Naumann's corridor, and that piece is called Untrodden Weed. Bouquet. And I cast, actually, you cast the concrete pedestal. The man of the pedestal is here. So these are some of the photographs, and I took a medium format and the square geometry. These are 3 foot by 3 foot, was intentionally to sort of mirror the formal geometry of the gardens themselves, or capture that geometry of the André Le Nôtre or the reconstructed gardens of Villandry by Joachim Cavallo. And by the way, this is the Garden of Love, the Jardin d'Amour, in which each of these parterre patterns represent a different kind of love, brotherly love, courtly love, etc. It's really a very medieval idea. The piece that Sarah mentioned, the Museum as Theater as Garden at MCA, is a permanent installation in their cafe space, which is on the rooftop, and it's this mirrored, 5-foot mirrored surface with 5-foot glass walls, and it is indeed this kind of glass space that's all about betweenness. It's neither inside nor outside, it's somewhere in the middle of that. And that betweenness, that cafe space really influenced or excited me in this idea, because I think that both and quality is what I'm looking for in my work, something that flips both setting and character. So these are, I made a collection of sculptures, they're 9 terracotta sculptures. That's a group of objects that reflects the eclecticism of a garden collection, where each plant might represent a specific place or culture, or culinary, pharmaceutical use. But my collection was really engaging different decorative and art histories, and likening it to the way in which museums are essentially collections of many things and many different cultures. So hybrid examines the realm between manipulated nature, or the genetically modified perhaps, and or the unadulterated. So it's a very reductive ball, and yet it has a profusion of flowers, so modernist reduction, but then embracing this aesthetic rooted in the decorative arts. Here's the other window, ground cover, Judd box. And then this asymmetric piece titled Weed was really about the kind of references to the cultural categories we apply to nature. Finally, succulent. So this dialogue with minimalism and with modernist traditions became a real dialogue in the sense that it's grounded in a conversation that I had, an ongoing conversation I've had with Robert Morris's work since I was a graduate student, but then I also taught with him at Hunter, so it was a real conversation too. And then he, you know, his work was profound, but this particular exhibition from the Green Gallery in 1964, which he made construction forms that were made into plinths, but the plinth as sculpture, flipping the way in which we understand what sculpture is at this time. It's really profound. So these are I-beams and L-beams and things like that. And I thought, in having this conversation with his work over the years, I thought, what would it mean if I took those same forms, or my version of those forms, and clad them with thousands of leaves? What would they become? How would that be another inversion? What kind of conversation could I create? So again, a decorative effect that was very much excluded from the dialogue within minimalist traditions creates yet something else. And I realized this became it was another place. It was outside these hedge forms. And then I wanted to pair them with another tradition that was as equally maybe extreme. Both of these, both the minimalism and Baroque, are art historical periods of great indulgence and great significance as well. So I came across a drawing by a 16th century architectural sculptor or historian, in which there are all these foliate covered animals, and they were part of a green man tradition in sculpture and architectural ornamentation. And I started to kind of play with that idea. What happens when you cover everything with leaves? Is the sculpture becoming a plant and then becoming a sculpture? And what does that mean to have these objects together, all somehow going to seed, if you will, being overtaken? And that whole idea of nature overtaking the highest culture is a very interesting idea for me to think about. So these are just some of the pieces that I've done over the time. And it took me about 2 years to assemble all the objects to create this installation. And the installation is called All is Leaf, which is after it's a quote from Goethe, and it's the culminating statement that he made after 12 years of his botanical journey, in which he was trying to find the Urpflanze, which is he called the Eve of all plants. Like if there was one mother of all plants, what would it look like? And he ended this whole thing by saying, all is leaf. And it's this arguably really romantic statement, and yet to me engages this idea of that realm between the real and the ideal. So this is the exhibition. It starts with a slab that floats off the ground a few inches, 5 feet by 5 feet, then half arch. And it's really kind of a deconstructed garden, if you will. Wolfgang's lion. Dear. The departure. The kite, the bird of prey, and then inverted L. And then that's an I-beam that's 10 feet long, just to give you a sense of scale. And then it ends with this 2-foot-high corner. And then the view from the back, it's a sort of tumbled down, deconstructed or garden ruin, if you will. At this time, I was doing a lecture in which somebody asked me about the wall forms. Why were you doing these wall forms? And one student answered the question by saying, well, she's been exploring the garden all her life. She's finally made it to the garden wall. And I was like, oh my God, you're absolutely right. As soon as that was said, I kind of had this moment of, yes, I'm at the wall. And this idea of wanting to make that wall became something that I thought about for quite a while. And I did, but not just the wall, but this sort of idea of something that brought all these ideas together for me: painting, sculpture, performance, illusion. So this piece, Color Field, was, I think, a little step toward that. And I thought about a couple of people in particular who who I felt brought all those pieces together in a way that was deeply inspiring. And one of them is Jim Hodges, a piece called No Between. He's done many of these, from 1997, in which their fabric flowers deconstructed, then sewn end to end to return to their fabric nature in this curtain of falling petals. Or this incredible piece by John Chamberlain called The Privet, which is 60 feet long, and it is painted automobile parts that are wonderfully kind of overcoming their weight and crumpled history to grow upward. Or Yo-Yo Kusama. This is a 60-foot-long painting that's lost that she did in 1961. That is a pattern of many, many tiny loops, which is kind of an extraordinary achievement. And there's so many chilling kinds of depictions of her as an artist, as sort of physically connected to her work and her mark making as any action painter. This is a quote. She said, "I feel as though I were driving along a highway or carried on a conveyor belt without ending to my death." She reported describing those sessions when she would work or paint for as much as 40 to 50 hours at one stretch, uninterrupted. She goes, quote, "This is like continuing to drink thousands of cups of coffee or eating thousands of feet of macaroni. This is to continue to desire and to escape all sorts of feelings and visions until the end of my days, whether I want to or not." And I don't know if you can see, but this is the scale of that painting at 60 feet. So Millefleurs came out of this kind of reverie, really, for me. And there's one other influence that was particular, which is I'm someone who reads poetry, and I have some favorite poets, and one of them is Francis Ponge, and he's a French modernist poet who dedicated a whole book. It's a book-length poem called Le Prix, which is the meadow. And it deconstructs that place and reconstructs it. And somehow the idea of creating a wall in which I could have a meadow of flowers superimposed upon a field of sculpted leaves, and create this, this meadow that maybe appeared to continue past the confines of the wall, dissolving the boundaries of the wall itself, became really intriguing. So I had, so that's one side features this image from The Unicorn in Captivity. It's a swath of an actual tapestry image. And then the other side is a green wall, which really is about this other sense of enclosure, kind of continuous surface of green leaves. But they're all variable in tone, and suggest this garden, both sides suggesting the garden by that one defining characteristic, which is that boundary that separates it from the other surrounding landscape. So it just gives you a sense of the scale. And I did this for I was invited to do this for the Anschutz Gallery, which is a very angular gallery in the Denver Art Museum. And my response to that space was to make something very rectilinear and calm. So I wanted to take an actual swath of a tapestry, which is the Millefleurs is a specific referent to these idealized meadows. And so I found one and tempered it, and then blew it up to the scale of the plant, because it's a much smaller scale tapestry than the image that I have on my piece. The image I projected was at the scale of the plant, much bigger. And so in order to do that, the projection has to be, you have to paint to the projection. So these are raw glazed quatrefoil tile that are painted in stain. It's an Italian Majolica technique. It's ancient. and then pulled off, numbered, labeled, arrowed, and then fired and replaced. So the idea was this idea of a mirage too, where that you would come at this piece from a distance and see it clearly, and then as you got closer, it dissipates and breaks up and fragments and becomes pixelated, the way a mirage disappears. And somehow, I wanted to somehow bring all the things together if I could. And so here it is right outside the door in such a nice and incredibly lush, beautiful environment, where this would be an experience that is always and constantly changing. The effects of light, the way the reflections happen on it, the shadows, time of day, would change one's perception of it. And that somehow it would be both theatrical set or theater screen, painting, a sculpture, an architectural fragment that represents the scale of the interior while wanting to belong to the scale and environment of the exterior. And now I'm showing you very quickly two little short public projects which I've done recently, and one was invited by the Danish Ministry of Culture to come and make a piece for a town hall in Slagelse, which is Radhus, in this brutalist architectural building. But I had the opportunity to go there and do research, do a site-specific or site-responsive piece. And the two things that defined this particular town, Slagelse, was the vibrant Viking history and also its agricultural richness. What I found out about the Viking ships is that they were such an advanced culture, but they were so incredibly built. There are 7 different woods for all the different types, parts of the boats that yielded their incredible ability to navigate very rough seas, cold waters. And those woods are all growing everywhere that I looked. So lime, beech, oak, etc. And so what I did is I took that kind of cultural history and then agricultural history, and then the design influence of this Celtic society, essentially. And this is Sutton Hoo, but this was very much what was designed at the time. And then wove them together literally into a piece that was for this place in a kind of knotted pattern. And then, I'm sorry, you're going to see. In fact, finding all those leaves of all those trees in the landscape, making my own versions, casting them multiply, and then creating a piece where those lines are literally braided into the form. And then the glaze enhancing that, those lines, or bringing out those lines. This is the piece installed in the hallway next to the mayor's portrait. Not a very exciting sight, not so beautiful, but a really interesting project. And it's for me to engage and think about and be part of. And it was, the piece was called Words Are Leaves, Deeds Are Fruit. And then I was invited also to do a commission, a temporary commission for the Denver International Airport, in which I was given the site of the central, the main terminal. And in that top, I guess I have a pointer somewhere. Oh, I don't know if I want to push that button. Anyway, up there is the map of the entire first level of the main terminal, where there is a huge Native American terrazzo floor that is after a Native American rug pattern that depicts the 4 rivers of Colorado that then converge right where you come up as a tourist, or right when you come up and you come out to the main terminal from the tram. And that's where I cited the sculpture, right as a paradise rug, if you will, on top of those 4 rivers, this paradise idea. And then there used to be a fountain there that so I kind of nodded to the fountain. There's a fountain in the central image, and then 4 rivers. But this is also a hugely vertical space. So I decided, rather than trying to compete with the verticality of this space, to go horizontal. And the piece is an aerial perspective of a formal garden, but the formal garden is an airfield, so it's really airfield as field, or at least what my intention was. And it's 15 feet by 15 feet and floats off the ground by 5 inches, so it hovers. And the circular image is based on the fact that all airfields are named, all the airfield numbers and so on are named after, and this is 34R, 16L, after degrees on the compass in order for pilots to know which runway to be on. It's all compass-like. And one of the most exciting aspects of this commission was being taken on a tour of the runways. Wow. I had no idea. You just can't fathom the scale of these runways. And some of these are the longest runways in the world at DIA. But that's 34L. You could actually see the curvature of the Earth in looking down these runways from standing on them. And there was a plane that took off above us. It was crazy. So embedded in this maze or matrix are little hints at that airfield. And this is also important because this project took, I had to do this in half the time that I had to do the Millefleurs wall, which took a year from conception to completion. This piece we had 6 months, and I enlisted a small army of helpers, part-time helpers. And here are some of them. In fact, we kept joking for quite a while that we should. And so I made T-shirts, or that we were part of a factory. So they Leaf Factory T-shirts with the quatrefoil, and I made. Anyway, it was fun and a lot of work. But here we are in this, and maybe could you, oh yeah, pause it just for a second. I'm going to show you to kind of give credit to my silent collaborators here in terms of the people who really helped me do these projects on such a large scale. I wanted to show you this video. One of the women who worked for me, who came to work on this project in specific, made a stop action kind of animation time-lapse piece of the last part of this project being mounted, glazed, remounted, and then packed. And it was 1/9 of the project. There are 2 other rooms in which we are mounting other parts of that project. So you'll see me coming in and out doing some of it, but there are so many people, and the frenetic dance that you're going to see is very much the character of the last essentially 4 days of this project. I asked each of them to take a bow before they left the screen altogether. So you're going to see a bunch of people standing there and taking bows, and that's why. So maybe we could start it. Thanks, Megan. The last part of Parterre. So that just gives you a little taste. And then I'm just showing some images of work I just got out of the kiln yesterday or the day before. So a painting, large painting called bush painting. And then a new piece that's a polychrome inverted L that every side is a different color, different primary, secondary colors, kind of a playing with this painted surface, and it almost becomes a toy. So finally, the last thing, and this is, I think this is suitable to really what this museum is doing, but academic institutions have changed considerably, both in character and in self-conception, since Plato founded the academy. Yet in their highest humanistic calling, they remain certifiably faithful to Plato's pedagogical revolution in its essential components, to give birth to knowledge rather than information, memory rather than mnemonics, commitment rather than compliance. From Socrates, Plato learned that certain kinds of pedagogy make their appeal to what is most personal in a student's selfhood, a recess in the self that is at once removed from and open to the world. If one conceives of that recess as a garden of sorts, as Plato did, then one can understand why he spoke of educators as gardeners of the soul, and why some of us, whether we consider ourselves his direct heirs or not, think of universities as among the most precious gardens in the world, end quote. And that's from one of my favorite books, Robert Pogue Harrison's Gardens, an essay on the human condition. So thank you so much.